Hey everyone, this is Kong with the first episode of a new series called Should You Summon? Now, my intention with these videos is not to be big, in-depth guides or builds for these characters, but rather a quick and dirty overview of some of the high-level features of these heroes to help you decide if you want to spend your hard-earned vouchers and crystals trying to summon and add these to your box. So for higher level players who've been playing for a long time, you already kind of know, pull who you want, or who you need to fill a gap in your roster. But for newer players, I see a lot of players who are just kind of starting out, asking on Reddit every time a new banner comes around. Are these characters that I should be summoning for? Should I try to add such and such character? Especially when you're working with limited resources, it can be hard to make that decision. So my goal is going to be to answer those questions by looking at three really basic criteria. The first one is how they fit into your team. The second is, do you need them to unlock any bonds? And the third is, what kind of content are they used for? So, barring any in-depth considerations about niche uses or being a personal fan of such and such character, obviously summon for your waifus if that's what you're playing the game for. But these three criteria are going to be kind of the basics for helping you decide if you should go hard summoning a character or not. So without further ado, let's jump into the current Origins of Light banner, featuring Alustriel, Gerold Layla, and Jugler. So the first character I'll talk about on this banner is Alustriel. She is a highly mobile, hit-and-run, all-terrain ranged unit. She's a member of the Legion of Glory, Origins of Light, and Strategic Masters factions. So if you're primarily running one of those factions, you may find a spot for her. The faction buffers for Legion of Glory are Ledin, Elwyn, and Grenier. For Origins of Light, Dehart, Jugler, and Freya. And for Strategic Masters, Altamuller and Lanford. As far as her bonds, she's not really that necessary. She herself is not required to unlock the bonds for any other SSR characters, so she's not going to be a roadblock for any other characters that you might be developing. And in terms of who she needs to unlock her own bonds, it's just Matthew for the defensive bond and Almeida for the attack bond. So both free characters that you get to start the game, so there's no real roadblock to fully building her either. And as far as the kind of content that she mostly gets used for, she can be useful for Ancient Beckoning for the Hugin and Munin fight, partly on account of her being a good mobile ranged unit. She's not really a meta unit for anything else specifically, and she doesn't get a lot of play in PvP currently. She does have a unique piece of equipment coming out that will allow her to passively ignore guard. So she may get some use in PvP once that equipment comes out, because she'll be able to basically pick off units around tanks, which could be useful. In terms of general purpose use, I like these kinds of units who have kind of mobility and utility, so you could find a spot for her in your team for story missions, guild wars, if you're auto-battling the different guild war levels, for example, and that kind of all-purpose PvE use. So the next character we'll look at is Gerold Layla. Now, Gerold and Layla are traditionally quite an underrated unit, and there are a lot of reasons for that. When they first came out in the initial batch of heroes in the game, they required a lot of investment to really get the most use out of them, whereas other characters were pretty good right out of the box. Furthermore, Gerold and Layla didn't have Gates of Fate at that time, so you couldn't grind their star levels up like you can now. So the only way to really build them up was to summon them, and to add insult to injury, they don't really appear on a lot of banners. Their talent also got a tweak to add a few more special little abilities, like the ability to debuff across the map, which is just super handy. So Gerold and Layla were quite underrated for all these reasons. They kind of fill the same or a similar role as Chris in terms of being a secondary healer getting lots of group heals, group debuffing, self-heals based on their different abilities. It was a bit of a tougher sell because, like I said before, they're less common as an SSR unit and not the easiest SSR unit to acquire, whereas everyone pretty much will end up getting a well-built Chris just as a consequence of playing the game. So how do they fit into your team? Gerold and Layla were originally only Origins of Light characters, but they had the Strategic Masters faction added to them. So the Origins of Light faction buffers are Dehart, Jugler, and Freya. The Strategic Masters buffers are Altamüller and Lanford. I think they fit fairly well in a Strategic Masters team because their healing utility really complements the other characters there, and also Altamüller's faction buff increases their mobility, which they find fairly handy. Do you need them to unlock any bonds? Gerold and Layla actually do unlock the defensive bond for Tieris, and Tieris is a widely used meta unit for almost every game mode. Lots of people who end up pulling Gerold and Layla or trying to pull for them, it's almost solely for that reason. And that's a legitimate reason, which is one of the reasons I include it as a consideration here. If you're building up or focusing on your favorite characters or characters that you use a lot, you want to be able to max them out. You want to be able to unlock all their bonds, and if you need to summon a character to do that, in most cases it's worth it. I personally don't really consider defensive bonds 100% necessary for healers, but Tieris gets used in almost all the endgame content, so it never hurts. Now, on the flip side, Gerold and Layla do require Tieris for their defensive bond and Dehart for their attack bond. And in terms of the content that they get used for, similar to Alustriel, they're kind of a jack-of-all-trades utility unit. Most players tend to run them in their Layla class, which is the Holy class. They're very interesting because, as part of their talent, when you're in Layla's class, you don't have a damage penalty when you're attacking at melee range. So they can... they're not going to one-shot a bunch of units, but their damage isn't nerfed, basically. So they can get a hit in here and there. They can use sorceresses, which you'll probably have built up for other characters, so it's always nice to be able to get a little bit more use out of troops that you've already invested in. You do have that option, like I said, to have a kind of ranged or melee attacker, and then you're getting some healing on the side. They do actually have some utility for Ancient Beckoning. They're quite useful for the Jormungandr and Sleipnir fights, mainly because of the factions that you get bonuses for using in those fights, and because their secondary healing is pretty handy. I've read about some people using them in their Gerold class and then giving them the Clothesline Pole or the Feather Duster to basically have the kind of opposite version of Layla's talent, being able to attack at melee and at range and also get some range heals. Personally, I think any strategy that involves using the Feather Duster is probably going to be a little bit of a niche or personal preference strategy, but it's something you could try out if you do end up pulling them. And finally, the last unit on the banner is Jugler. In terms of how he fits into your team, he is on the Origins of Light, Meteor Strike, and Mythical Realm factions. For Mythical Realm, the faction buffer is Gizaroth. For Meteor Strike, it's Serida. And for Origins of Light, Dehart, Jugler, and Freya. So Jugler does carry his own faction buff. In terms of unlocking bonds, a couple more common characters look for Jugler. You need Jugler to unlock Pierre's attack bond and Sophia's defensive bond. So whether you use those characters or not, that can at least be useful for getting a couple extra crystals out of their bond unlocks. And in terms of Jugler's own bonds, he needs Sophia to unlock his defensive bond and Liphany to unlock his attack bond. So fairly accessible on that front. He doesn't need any rare SSR characters to fully unlock him. Now, in terms of what type of content Jugler is used for, Jugler is basically, along with Landius, the premier PvP tank. You'll basically see him in pretty much everyone's high-level Apex Arena box, and at higher levels you'll end up seeing him in regular arena modes quite a bit as well. Of course, that doesn't mean he's necessarily confined to PvP. There are a couple ancient beckoning fights, such as Fenrir or Jormungandr, that make good use of Jugler's abilities, in particular tanking AoE. One thing to note about Jugler is that he's quite a high investment unit. Typically, you want to class him out, so basically use all 3 paths worth of runestones on him. He also thrives with lobster behemoths as his soldiers, and not a lot of other characters use them, so it can be another expensive investment to crank those soldiers up, basically just for him to use. If you're planning on putting a lot of attention and focus into PvP, it could be worth trying to summon just for Jugler alone. He is pretty much essential in terms of having tanking options for PvP. So just to wrap up, brief little overview. We have Alustriel, who's a mobile hit-and-run ranged unit, mostly used, for now at least, for kind of PvE utility, running guild wars, that kind of thing. But she does have a unique piece of equipment coming up that might give her some use in PvP. Gerold and Layla, another kind of interesting unit that you can tailor to suit your own needs. Lots of secondary healing, debuffing, lots of different ways to play them. Definitely useful for unlocking Tierras' bonds, and also useful for a couple ancient beckoning fights. And finally, Jugler, an essential PvP tank who requires a lot of investment, but the investment pays off. So hopefully this was helpful and helped you make a decision about whether to summon or not on this banner. I'm going to keep making these for other banners as they come up, so if there's anything else you'd like to see or hear in these overviews in terms of what's important for you to know when you're trying to make that decision about whether to spend your vouchers on a character, let me know in the comments. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next Should You Summon.